Welcome to
Welcome,
Half Brain.
Half Heart, right? Kind of this, how are you managing this attack, right? Because thinking about if there are DEI practitioners who are listening to this, it's kind of like, or whatever the situation is, people of color, period. Um, this about managing stress that way of kind of removing yourself or limiting
Limiting and
where you get your
information
Mhm.
and being really mindful of
Yeah.
what platforms. Because I find network news, and I wrote a whole chapter about this in my last book. Network news is designed these days, right? If it bleeds, it leads. It's, the more horrific, the better. And so you get, if a show was really an hour long, you're getting 50 minutes of horror and then 10 minutes split between weather and a cute puppy story, right?
Right.
50 minutes of horror and network news, you're also getting the visuals.
Yes.
So, and you have no control over that, at least reading the newspaper, right? You can read the headlines, you
Headline.
can skim, you can, there's one picture, it's not a whole video. And, video is definitely getting into our brains a
Yes.
lot more than one picture. And so I totally encourage people to pay attention to how you take in information and how you take in the news, because so much of it then can cause so much disturbance in your inner peace.
hmm
And it doesn't mean being ignorant and not knowing what's going on. It means just being mindful of,
hmm
10 wins. That's at least, or those kinds of news stations.
Yeah.
The same thing is going to go around for 10, 15 minutes. So it's much shorter, much more contained. You're not getting the visual. And then you can always decide to go a little deeper if you want
hmm
to. So really being focused on how you moderate your interaction with it. And I suggest nobody start the day watching network news, because then you're starting off your day with so much anxiety, right? So much death. And yes, these things are happening in the world, but equally in the world, there are people who are rescuing people. There are people who are helping people. Like all those things are happening in the world too. And we don't hear nearly as much about that as we hear about all the negative things.
Well, and then just to add one more thing to that, I feel like in that like breakdown that you gave, 60 minutes, 50 minutes on this, the horror, 10 minutes between like puppy and weather. I would like it's part of it. I don't know factually, but it feels like even in that 50 minutes, most of it is conjecture or what they think or fear mongering rather than the facts, right? And so
Yes.
to your point about the newspaper or articles, you can go in and typically for the most part, they're it's at least written in a very concise way. Whether or not they're actual facts or not might be a different thing. But at least it's like this is what you're getting, boom, 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 as
Mhm.
opposed to the whole like dance of like how are we keeping people captive? How are we keeping people engaged? How are we basically bringing them along this like emotional roller coaster?
Exactly.
Um that's like so then again, it's just like it's pulling on these things that you have inside yourself with these fears and like all this other stuff. This a friend of mine sent me something the other day about like some issue, like some tragedy that happened in Louisiana. And I was just like, in there's one moment I'm like, why do we do this? Like, right? Like, first of all, it's like in the northwestern part of Louisiana, but it was sent and it was like, be careful out there. And I was like, that's like the equivalent of sending me something in Seattle, but also telling me to be careful. And I get where it comes from. And you get like it's this like a fear, it's this thought, it's this caring, it's all this stuff wrapped into a bubble. But it's like there's also that place where you're just like, but this isn't like, is it helpful? Right? Like, or what's can we think a little bit more intentionally as individuals about why, and is the person ready in a space to receive it? Like what is that going to stir up for that person? And especially when it's in related to a conversation that you're having about like maybe a somewhat similar incident, right? So it's like I don't know, I'm talking about dating a new person, like a new person, and then you send a story about somebody got murdered by somebody that they just met, and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, but then on the other hand, you're like, but I hope it works out. Well, now I think I'm dating a murderer. Like, come on, folks. Um,
Yes, I think that when as you said, be careful out there. What does that mean? Right? That's
Right.
it's so
Yeah.
vague that it's really hard to figure out what do you do with that. it's so much more helpful to say, okay, well, if you're doing online dating, then these are the things that you might need to double check for your
Right.
safety, right? But that be careful out there just raises anxiety because
Exactly.
now you know there's danger, and what
Right.
do I do with that?
Right.
So I
Because
try
you
to
react to different dangers differently, right? So now I'm
exactly.
like, do I bring nunchucks? Am I supposed to have like, like, what does that mean?
What does that mean? So really focusing in on what does it mean and being more thoughtful when you send things like that to people.
Yes.
Like, are you ready? Right?
Yeah.
Are you ready for this? That's
Yeah.
loosely related. Just had a thing with my child's school. They're reading a book and there's a horrific scene in the book, and the teachers like reading it in class, and they kind of say, well, there's some disturbing material, but they don't really understand what it means to warn somebody first. So disturbing material is one thing, right? But it's not enough, right? So,
Mhm.
because the person can't get their brain really ready for it, like, okay, that's like the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
be careful, okay.
Uh,
What
yeah.
they really needed to say is there is a rape scene in this,
Right.
so that
Yes.
then people can get themselves ready for that. And so
Yes.
I tried to send a message to the school, the teachers, and of course they're like, "Well, that's why we read it in school together, and we warn them." And it's like, you're not understanding what a trauma warning really is. That's not enough, right? That's still, and if it was enough, I know you read it in school with the students because my student, that's how I heard about it, right?
Right.
But it's my student who came home and said, I really wish they would give a trauma warning about this, right? Who was in the class when the teacher said, well, this is going to be some disturbing material. My student is coming home and saying they don't understand what a trauma warning is. So I'm, as a licensed clinical psychologist, sending them
Right.
information. It's like, well, that's why we do this. Hello, something's still missing. You're not doing quite enough. You're doing something,
Right.
and I appreciate that. But really, it's different to say there's some disturbing material and to say there's going to be a rape scene here so that any student that's had any trauma around that can now either get themselves ready or opt out and say, I really can't read that chapter, or, I really don't want to be in this room while that's happening, or even just realize afterwards when they're upset, oh my gosh, maybe that's why I'm having a good day.
And I don't know if it's like the empath, the like operations person in me, and all of those things says like, okay, you said that. To your point, can a student actually what happens if a student says, "I am not prepared," or I feel like I can read that?" What do you have in place where that child can go get up and go somewhere or get up and do what are you doing? Are you sending them to the principal's office? Is there a resource room that you're sending them to? What are they doing with that time? Have you thought about that? Um, Also, have you thought about how that might make a child feel to self-identify having an issue with whatever comes on? Because now
Exactly.
everybody around them is like, either you're soft or why are you so freaked out by this? What happened to you? Blah, blah, blah,
Exactly.
blah, blah, blah. Did you think about that? Did you not think about that? And then even after you give a trauma warning or a trigger warning, however you want to phrase it, okay, I thought I was going to be okay with it. Now I've read through it. And now I'm like, these emotions, these feelings, this whatever is happening, maybe I'm reflecting on something that almost, whatever it is,
Hmm.
what support are
Exactly.
you offering? Are you providing? Or do I just go into algebra class?
Hmm.
So,
Exactly.
like, I'm like, my head is like, great, you did the bare minimum in that situation to like be able to be like,
Exactly, right, because it actually might be better to give them the trigger warning, and that is the proper term, the trigger warning, not a trauma
yeah,
warning. The trigger warning, and then have them read it at home, right? So that they're not being outed in school, right? So
yeah,
that they can maybe opt out of reading that chapter or opt out of
yeah,
reading those pages, right? How about give them a trigger warning and say, this is an issue. There is a rape scene on page 55 to 61. And
yes,
therefore, if this is a challenge for you, you can opt out of those pages and make sure that nothing on the test is going to be from those pages, right? And it, yeah, so it's so interesting. And I know for some people, the solution is like a book burning, like don't read the book. I don't think that's a solution either
right.
because it is the book. Kite Runner is the book, and
Okay,
it is
okay, yeah,
about
oh, yeah,
culture. And so
yeah,
I think it's great that they are digging into this material, but finding the balance and definitely supporting the students more and listening when like the other thing I guess that's a little challenging is a licensed psychologist has contacted you, right? And so just saying, oh, we're doing that. Clearly, if I'm contacting you with some concern, I'm not just, I'm a parent and there's like
right,
impact
right,
to be addressed. but I'm also clearly on my signature, it says licensed clinical psychologist. So I'm not just a parent, I'm a parent and a professional in the field. So if I'm saying, I'm concerned about this, then it's coming from a parental place, but it's also coming from a professional place.
Right.
Would you like to come talk
And
about it? Can you help us with this?
right. And it goes to this is I have this huge like issue with like one of my biggest pet peeves is when people listen to respond rather than listen to understand or listen to learn.
Yes.
Um, and enter into every conversation with the assumption of either one of us has to be right, one of us has to be wrong, or one of us has to convince the other. Like we can have a great, and if I'm to toot my own horn, I think that's also why I'm so successful in DEI spaces and shifting people's thinking is because my intent is never to one, say that you're wrong, one to really change your mind. I'm really just saying, hey, have you considered this perspective? Have you thought about something like this? Or here's another way or this is how other people may see it.
Yes.
You could choose, or you could say, nah, I still feel like I'm right, or I still want to see it this way. I still want to go about it this way. But at least I feel like I'm successful. If you can sit here and we can have an intelligent conversation and maybe it'll be go up in volume, maybe it'll be passionate, maybe it'll be up and down. But if we can walk away and just say, but I heard you, to still 10 toes down on what I think,
Hmm.
but I at least see where you're coming from. Doesn't resonate with me, but I see where you're coming from.
Yes. Trying to understand the other person's perspective, even you don't have to agree with it,
You
but
don't
to
have to
try to
agree.
at least understand where they're coming
And
from.
then
And
the
that's the
next
whole
time you
point of
have,
literature, right? The whole point of the book is to try to
well,
give the students an opportunity to understand the perspective. No, that would be my point of the book.
that would be your point of literature. I feel like the point of literature in schools today, at least again in the US, is more about here are these 5 things that we have decided that this book was about, this book was supposed to do, this was the intention. You're reading it to see these 5 things.
Yeah, that's
And then a
important.
student can come in and, well, actually, I didn't see it that way. I saw it this way. Nope, you're wrong because we've studied this literature, we've studied this book for 20 years, 100 years. This is what we know the book is about.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems with education. We don't teach students, especially like primary, high school, we don't teach students to be critical thinkers. We teach them to repeat back what we've already determined to be what it is.
I totally agree with you. And when I taught in college as a professor, what I strive to do more than anything was to teach students to think. And
Mhm.
I welcome them to disagree with me, which was so hard for students because, of course, hardly anybody else is doing that.
Yeah.
It's like, what I want from you is to think. I want you to grapple with stuff. It's not all about, I had some assignments that I set up where we graded, the grade was if you turned it in, right?
Yeah.
That pass fail idea, which I love
Yeah.
because if it's pass fail, then you're inviting somebody to grapple with it. And it's not
Mhm.
all about the final grade. And I'm in a system, so I couldn't do that for everything. But I
Yeah.
tried to always have a couple of assignments was really, it's just about you turning it in and turning it on time. I want
Mhm.
you to grapple with this stuff because that's where the learning is when you're
Yeah.
struggling with it. And I want you to struggle with it. Like I want you not to fail, but to have difficulty here because that's where you're going to learn something. Just memorizing stuff, that's easy. Anybody can do that. But learning to think
Mhm.
critically, to evaluate, that is what's important. And that's what really education should be about. Because I mean, really, how often do any of us have to add fractions except for when I'm cooking? I mean,
Right.
there's so many things that
Yeah.
you get when you're in school that you literally will never have to use again. But
Mhm.
if you learn how to think and evaluate, to research, to discern, and I think
Yeah.
it's even more important these days with so much information on the internet, right? So much
Mhm.
information
Mhm.
coming from all sorts of places to be able to discern, well, is this person that put this out? Like, how biased are they? Right? You want to figure out if milk is healthy for you, and the Milk Council is putting up this website. Is that the best place to evaluate whether milk is healthy for you? Right? Or do you need to go to Consumer Report, something like that, which is a non-biased platform? Like being able to do that is even more important today when you have so much access to information that's not checked, but yet we're doing even less in teaching it.
Right. I 100% agree. Slightly off subject, but you probably haven't seen it because I wasn't gonna watch it. But Amanda Seals? Are you
Eh,
familiar with her?
oh yeah, yes.
So she's been targeted by, or I won't say targeted. She has experienced what she feels like is being kind of ostracized by a lot of like Black media, Black publications. She had made a comment maybe about a month ago about not being invited to, I guess, the BET Awards or some Black Awards show. And I think she said it from a place of like, kind of like, I'm hurt, right? Like, I'm someone who does so much and is so outspoken about my love of Black people, of Black culture, um, defending and showing up and doing all this work. And then in these spaces, I'm not welcomed or I'm not included.
Mhm.
And so there became a whole big hullabaloo around like the why kind of thing, right? I guess it was people responding and saying, like, one, like, you are caustic, you're arrogant, you're all of these things. And then how dare you try to be vulnerable in this moment and be like, oh, they didn't invite me. And so it just became this kind of whole big thing. And it's just an interesting, so all of that to say, and so sorry, after she had made that statement, a lot of Black publications came out and had these like, what did she call them? Like, and I haven't even read them, but they were like, what do you call them? Like a hit article or something, like hit something.
Not clickbait.
No, not clickbait. It was something like hit pieces or something like that. So I guess it was almost like trying to annihilate her character further or something like that.
Wow.
And so they were talking about how, and this is actually an interesting, maybe another topic, a podcast where they were talking about like being likable at work,
Mhm.
right? And then how sometimes it's not about whether or not you could do the job or you do the job well, it's about how well you are liked within the organization. And so they were like kind of saying Amanda has never been likable and Amanda has never put in effort to play nicely with others.
Mhm.
And therefore, like, this is what her situation is, right? And like, she can only blame herself. Long story short, so there were a couple of articles with that. She kept responding on her social outlets saying, unfair, you don't know me, how dare you talk about this, blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
She eventually got invited to this podcast, show, YouTube podcast, whatever, with Shannon Sharp, who I think is like, yeah, I don't really know. I'm actually impressed that I like know some of these names and some of these. I'm like you. I'm so like, what I get is what I get. I'm not really. I call my friends and I'm like, can you explain to grandma what's going on? Like, why should I care about this? And they're like, oh God, grandma, sit down. Like, okay. And now I'm not interested anymore. Never mind. Shut up. I'm gonna go bake bread. um, so he apparently is like he was a athlete, sports person, is now kind of, I guess he has this like podcast show where he invites pop culture or relevant people to the table, to his living room, and they have a drink and they talk about whatever. But it's usually the people who are like, he did Cat Williams, anybody who's like in it right now. So he invited her to the show. They were having this conversation, and I won't get into the whole thing because it's a really long thing. Like I said, I wasn't planning on watching it. A friend of mine texted me and made some comments about it, and I was like, it's a friend that I respect, and we have good conversations. I was like, so now I gotta feel like I gotta watch it and listen. Blah. So I ended up listening to it like most of off and on yesterday. But what was interesting was even in that like less so about like what was said kind of thing. It was more of the dynamic of how they were talking about to each other and how the conversations were going. So I mean, if you know anything about Amanda is brilliant. Amanda uh is like, and it also made me think about this when we first started our conversation. She's like a multi hyphenate, right? She's like a comedian, an author, an actress, a scholar, an activist, da 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 da, all these things. And so she's very, very well learned, very well studied, very well read. And then you have Shannon Sharp, who is obviously someone who is charming and has some appeal, but is not a journalist, is not an interviewer, and has not probably studied or researched the craft at all
Yeah.
to even be able to have a conversation with any kind of real, like a real conversation, real kind of interview, right? But then also to have Amanda's kind of like gravitas and everything. It just was such a not a great match.
Yeah.
And it was just fascinating how Amanda would bring up this point And then Shannon would just kind of like, he wasn't really able to like address it or have that really meaty conversation and that back and forth. So then it ended up feeling so surface level and so um almost like you're arguing with your kid on the corner or you're arguing with your friends on the corner. You know what I mean? Like it just, it wasn't, and it's not, I don't even want to say it's like an intellectual level, but I share all of this to say it was like this critical thinking ability, right? Like where you have some experience and you have some verbiage and you have some things to say, but like it's not even it's the math is not mathing and how you're describing it. So she would talk about her experience of, being a precocious child, correcting adults because she was so exposed to so many different things. She was an only child, all these things. And so she didn't always have that ability, or I guess maybe was kind of coached as a child, or when to say something and when not to say something, right? And so